55 countries, more than 1 billion people, a grand plan to create the United States of Africa. From courts and currency to peace and prosperity, we'll bring you the A to Z of the AU. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Unions of states are going through a tough time. The European Union is worried its divorce from Britain could trigger a bigger breakup. And the United States can't seem to stop arguing. But one family of nations is growing. In January, Morocco rejoined the African Union, meaning it now represents an entire continent of more than 1 billion people. Its ambitious plans even include a single currency. But critics say it's a long way from creating a United States of Africa. Insight's Yasmin Khatun-Dewan has our A to Z of the AU.
Trump, Brexit, division and nationalism. 2017 has been called the year internationalism came to an end. But in Africa, things appear to be going the other way.
The return of our country to its natural place reflects our determination to defend our interests and those of the African Union.
Morocco has rejoined the African Union after a 33-year absence, making it once again a complete continent-wide bloc. Last year, an African passport was also unveiled, with the Rwandan and Chadian premiers becoming the first to receive them. Recent reports also suggest an Africa-wide currency may be on its way.
In an era where the European Union seems to be falling apart at the seams and where many Western governments are becoming more inward-looking, the tendency in Africa at the moment is the complete opposite. It's to open up borders, it's to integrate more, it's to try and do business and politics on a continent-wide scale.
Originally called the Organisation of African Unity, the Confederation focused on liberation struggles from colonial rule and apartheid. But health, democracy, education, peace and human rights are now the Union's main priorities.
It's 20 or 30 years, Africa's challenges have changed completely, and it's been quite a struggle actually for the African Union to come to terms with that. One of the biggest challenges that Africa has faced is how to become a fully fledged economic player in the international arena. How could Africa start to throw its weight around so that it wasn't getting downtrodden by the European Union or the US economy?
Economy, both growth and independence, have become central to the Union's function. The main financial contributors to the African Union are South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria and, up until the recent war, Libya. Its late leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was a key figure for African unity. His belief in Pan-Africanism saw him push for a united Africa to rival the US and EU.
He was actually chair a year before he was killed. So, and at that point during his chairmanship, he was pushing for closer and closer ties, actually saying all these problems, if there were problems in Iraq and other places, if there were problems of security, it was Africa that needed to come up with its own solutions rather than waiting on the United Nations or other countries to try and impose their own model of solutions. Under Muammar Gaddafi had money to sustain their own domestic programs, but also to invest abroad and also to be a philanthropic element within the African context.
The space left from the downfall of Libya has encouraged others to step forward.
There's no doubt that Morocco's role towards the African Union has increased because of the death of Muammar Gaddafi, the former Libyan president, and the general chaos within Libya at the moment.
Morocco's occupation in the Western Sahara led to calls of neo-colonialism by some African nations, and its readmission into the Union was met with concern. But the tide is changing, and for most, it was a welcomed return and boost.
There's a new generation of leaders who believe in economics, the Chinese model. China became a global player from an economic rather than democracy or human rights issues. So Africa has got all these problems, but there are some that believe that if Africa becomes an economic giant, then it will be considered an equal and will be able to have the capacity to solve its problems.
With ongoing war and conflict in the continent, critics say the African Union lacks effectiveness and isn't doing enough to improve living standards or address human rights concerns.
They are hindered by the lack of power, the absence of a mandate, because what you need is a legal mandate to go into a country. If South Sudan or any country says, I'm not having AU forces, there's very little that you can do if you don't have the power. But what you have seen with the United Nations Security Council is in Libya and other places, they would have said, well, we are protecting civilians. This has been agreed by the UN Security Council, and then they can go in. The only way they can achieve this is if they sponsor a motion into the Security Council through the African members who will be there at the time, but they're not permanent members. So if it's vetoed, then where do you go? You can't really go anywhere.
Countries deploy forces wearing the African Union beret, but the organisation's emergency army has never been used. Funding is a central concern as the Union continues to struggle to meet its targets. The majority of the money coming in still comes from outside the continent.
For a long time, it was easy for these big economies to just roll along and try to get everything that they wanted. But at the moment, the AU is saying to them, actually, you need to sacrifice a little bit of your autonomy, a little bit of your sovereignty for the purposes of a much larger African agenda. And this is the first time, really, that the African Union has had to send that message to the likes of South Africa, Senegal, and Nigeria.
But how far are nations willing to put their own sovereignty at risk for a greater continental purpose, when the world around them is following a different course? Yasmin Khatoon Diwan, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by Stephen Chan, who is a Professor of International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Stephen, we've got this wonderful collection then of countries and territories. Are all of them fans of this AU idea?
They're all fans of the idea. There's no problem with affiliation to the idea. The actuality and what it will require in the future, I think you'll find many states are very, very much not wanting to participate in the great difficult steps that will require them to sacrifice sovereignty, put in money to make these good ideas into practical, lasting realities.
Are they the two big stumbling blocks, you think? Where's the cash going to come from? And do you have to surrender sovereignty to this African Union if the thing's going to work?
There's a third problem as well, and that is logistical. How do you do peacekeeping, for instance, when you don't have enough aeroplanes to take troops from one part of Africa to another? How can you do disaster relief? And again, you don't have the transport and the communication systems to be able to do that. So unity, if they want, can be a byproduct of development, but the two have got to go hand in hand.
How do you form a peaceful political economic power when many of the countries that make up this union are themselves still torn apart with internal fighting?
And it's not just internal fighting. Many of these various factions who are engaged in internal fighting have got external supporters from other African states. Yeah. And so there's a very, very real need for Africa to go beyond a period that Europe itself was in for many, many hundreds of years, for instance, of continental self-interest and the interests of individual parts of that continent. So that, for instance, if you look at the great wars in Congo, particularly in the southeastern part of Congo, a lot of those are fueled by interest groups and governments surrounding that part of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The prize that's dangled in front of all the leaders is this economic superpower, isn't it? But is that, like many prizes, actually a bit of an illusion? Or do you think there's genuine possibilities of everybody getting richer if Africa could work as one?
If it could work as one, but don't forget that all of these riches are established on minerals and raw materials, and there's no processing or industrial capacity to make this into valuable processed and manufactured goods that would be even more valuable to the outside world than simply importing the raw materials and then putting the manufacture on them themselves in the United States or in Europe or in China, for instance. So a key aspect of being able to utilize all these raw materials, all these resources, would be the need to industrialize and develop an industrial base, which is very, very difficult to do in Africa right now.
Because of a lack of investment or because of a lack of will, political will to do it?
I think there are a number of things, a lack of investment. All of these things require startup funds. I think there's a lack of education within not the general population, but within the leaderships of many African states. Old men who don't understand modern technological processes, for instance. Old men who don't understand electronic communications and solar power, and how all of these things can be shortcuts to a new form of industrialization that could indeed take Africa into the future.
And surely there will be rivalries, probably quite properly, like any union of nations on some kind of political coming together, about who is in control, how budgets are allocated. Can Africa overcome those difficulties?
It'll be a long time before they have a budget worth arguing about at the African Union. But should we come to that moment, say, in 10 years, 15 years' time, yes, there will be interest groups, just like in the United Nations. There's a big debate right now in Mr. Trump's United States of America about how much money they're going to continue to put into the United Nations. So those arguments are just going to be common to any large international organization.
And that difficulty means you see that kind of timescale of, what, 10 to 15 years. While Africa's getting itself to prepare for this African Union idea, the world will have moved on, won't it? And other arrangements and bilateral deals will have been done, which may prevent the AU ever functioning properly.
It will function properly. It may function one step behind the times. It can overcome this, again, with far-sighted leadership. The actual Secretariat of the African Union in Addis Ababa is full of very bright, technocratic young people. They're a perfect match for their counterparts in, say, the European Union and the European Commission. But it's very much a dead hand of political leadership that still thinks in ideological rather than in modern developmental terms. The Chinese have shown the way of how you can make a generation jump in technology, for instance, are the world leaders now in nanotechnology. That kind of imagination and understanding has got to come to the continent of Africa.
Would be needed to make it work.
Yes.
And some of the other practical ideas, like a unified currency, is that really necessary or even capable of being dreamt of at this time?
They can dream. It's a dream, of course, because it's practically impossible. It's hard enough in Europe, as we've been seeing. If there's no fiscal harmonization of all of the economic dealings and planning of all of the 55 states in Africa, there's not going to be the foundation for a currency.
Because Europe learned, didn't they, trying to smash economies together that aren't really on the same path or at the same point in the cycle doesn't really work.
It could work if the convergence criteria were more clearly spelt out and policed more rigorously, as they were not in Greece, for instance. But trying to coordinate that kind of fiscal coordination would be impossible among 55 different states.
Stephen, thank you for the moment. Our conversation will continue in just a minute. You're watching Inside. The Chinese are coming. Fears that Africa is facing a new kind of colonial power.